Sup guys, welcome to Mad Mass. So today we're going to be going over my picks for the top 10 mass monsters in bodybuilding history. The criteria I'm using is who is the biggest and freakiest bodybuilders within their era. All of the bodybuilders I'm including are IFBB pros and competed at the Olympia level. Some of them are Mr. Olympias, and a couple of them I consider to be uncrowned Mr. Olympias. The order of the list is chronological based on when each bodybuilder competed. I'm not comparing the bodybuilders to each other within the top 10 list because they're all such beasts it's hard to compare. So first off we have Lou Ferrigno. Lou had a long career in bodybuilding, competing in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. He started bodybuilding at an incredibly young age, winning his first pro show, the IFBB Mr. America, at the age of 18, the same year he graduated high school. He competed in the Olympia multiple times, including in 1977, where he competed against Arnold and was featured in the film Pumping Iron. His size isn't that impressive by today's standards, but competing in the golden era of the 1970s, he was definitely a mass monster by comparison. Look here, he's pretty much dwarfing Arnold. That's not to say he was a better bodybuilder than Arnold, because Arnold did have much better conditioning and shape, but it still is nonetheless impressive. So Lou also forayed into acting, playing the Incredible Hulk in a TV show, this further adding to his status as a mass monster. So next up we have Paul Dillette. Paul Dillette was a Canadian bodybuilder competing mainly in the 90s and 2000s. He competed at the Olympia 5 times, with his best placing being 5th at the 1994 Olympia. So Paul was a freak of nature, standing at 6 foot 2 inches tall and weighing 285 pounds on stage. Something that's important to note is that when he started competing, bodybuilding was still in the Lee Haney era, so Paul Dillette was definitely a step function up in terms of size. One of the main things, though, that held him back in terms of placings and withheld him from winning the Mr. Olympia title was his posing. He was a notoriously weak poser. His body would shake as he held a pose, and he wouldn't hold them long enough to adequately show off his physique at its fullest. So next up on the list we have Dorian Yates. Dorian Yates was an English bodybuilder and 6-time Mr. Olympia, winning consecutively from 1992 to 1997. Similar to Paul Dillette, he is often credited for ushering in the era of the mass monster. At the time, nobody had seen a bodybuilder so big, conditioned, and grainy all at once, and many consider him to have the best back in bodybuilding history. One controversy surrounding Dorian Yates is his win at the 1997 Olympia. He came into that Olympia with a bicep injury where his left bicep was noticeably smaller than his right. A lot of people think he didn't deserve the title that year, and the judges only gave it to him because they favor the reigning Mr. Olympia. So next up on the list, we have Nasser El Sambadi. Nasser was an Egyptian bodybuilder who competed mostly in the 90s. Nasser was an early mass monster, similar to Dorian Yates, and as you can see here, even by today's standards, he's still a freak, especially in the upper body. So Nasser's most notable competition was the 1997 Mr. Olympia, where he controversially finished second to an injured Dorian Yates. And as you can see here, he clearly got robbed in my opinion. He came in with one of the best versions of his physique, while Dorian's physique was all but ruined by the glaring asymmetry in his bicep due to his injury. Additionally, Dorian's conditioning was off, and his midsection was significantly more blocky than Nasser's. So I think it's fair to say Nasser is the uncrowned Mr. Olympia, and he deserved to beat Dorian in 1997. Fast forwarding to the 2000s, we have Ronnie Coleman. Ronnie Coleman is widely considered to be the greatest bodybuilding of all time and is tied with Lee Haney for the most Olympia wins with 8 consecutive Olympia titles from 1998 to 2005. He brought probably the freakiest physique the Olympia had ever seen. At his heaviest, he would weigh close to 300 pounds on stage, and he was also the strongest Mr. Olympia of all time, deadlifting 800 pounds, leg pressing 1 ton, repping out dumbbell press with 200-pound dumbbells, and all sorts of crazy lifts. He was also a full-time police officer during his Olympia reign, which is also extremely impressive. So next up, we have the German bodybuilder Günther Schlierkamp. So Günther competed in the 2000s in the same era as Ronnie Coleman. He was a massive bodybuilder, standing at 6 foot 1 inches tall and weighing up to 300 pounds on stage. Similar to Paul Dillette though, his height really played to his disadvantage. He was about the same weight as Ronnie Coleman, but Ronnie was 2 inches shorter at 5 foot 11, so he looked much fuller, and Günther was never able to beat Ronnie on the Olympia stage. So despite never winning the Olympia title, Günther did actually beat reigning Mr. Olympia Ronnie Coleman at the 2002 GNC Show of Strength. This is extremely rare for a reigning Mr. Olympia to be beaten at a different show. Despite this impressive performance though, at the GNC Show of Strength, Gunter controversially finished 5th place that year at the 2002 Mr. Olympia. And just looking here, Gunter is noticeably bigger and more vascular than Ronnie. Just look at the massive veins in the quads. Also, he had a much better midsection, while Ronnie had a noticeable gap in the midsection, which is a telltale sign of HGH use. So I think Gunter was robbed at the Olympia. He should have won the title. At the very least, his 5th place finish is absolutely ridiculous. He was beat by Ronnie, Kevin Levrone, Chris Cormier, and Dexter Jackson, despite the incredible package he brought to the stage. So I consider Gunter to be another uncrowned Mr. Olympia. So next up, we have 4-time Mr. Olympia, Jay Cutler. Jay Cutler also competed in the 2000s. He was an all-around mass monster. One of the most famous pictures of him is the quad stomp from the 2009 Mr. Olympia, where he looks just insane. The separation and featherings on the legs, as well as the fullness and roundness of the delts and biceps, make it one of the most iconic pictures in Olympia history. So Jay competed directly with Ronnie for the Olympia title in the 2000s and finished second to Ronnie multiple times, finally beating him in 2006. The Ronnie-Jay rivalry is one of the most famous in bodybuilding history. We have one more bodybuilder from the 2000s, and it's Markus Rühl. Markus Rühl was a German bodybuilder who competed mostly in the 2000s and was an absolute freak of a mass monster. I don't think anyone has shoulders and biceps as big and grainy as his. So he competed at the Olympia a total of 7 times, but he only cracked the top 6 once, taking 5th place in 2004. Despite his freaky size and conditioning, his placings were hurt because his proportions were just off. His shoulders and biceps were so big, they dominated the rest of his physique and gave him a really weird alien-like look. Also, his midsection was pretty blocky. So, although he never won the Olympia, he'll still go down as one of the greatest mass monsters of all time. Now turning to the modern era, we have Phil Heath. Phil Heath competed in the late 2000s and early 2010s, winning a grand total of 7 Olympia titles from 2011 to 2017 consecutively, tying Arnold Schwarzenegger for the number of Olympias won. So people don't necessarily think of Phil as being a mass monster because his proportions were so good, you kind of focus on that and forget how big he really was. But looking at his stats, he was up to 255 pounds in competition conditions, shredded to the bone at a height of only 5'9". So based on that, I say he's big enough to be considered a mass monster. And his conditioning was just insane. His glutes are shredded to have Ronnie Coleman levels of striations. Another strong point for Phil Heath is his symmetry and proportions, which were on point. He really looks like a bigger and better version of Flex Wheeler. Now, of course, you can't mention Phil Heath without mentioning the elephant in the room, which is the bubble gut. So really starting in 2016 and getting worse in 2017 and 2018, Phil started developing the bubble gut, but that's a whole other issue, and in this video, his placing is just based on Phil Heath in his prime physique, which was 2011-2012. Last off on the list at number 10, we have Big Ramy. Big Ramy is an Egyptian bodybuilder who obviously is still competing today. Ramy is called big for a good reason. He's the only major bodybuilder today, or really ever, who has consistently showed up on stage weighing 300 plus pounds. He has maybe the biggest quads in the history of bodybuilding, and his upper body is big enough to look proportional to his legs. While his conditioning lacks something to be desired, he doesn't have a bubble gut at all, which is really impressive given his size. So Ramy has never won the Olympia, and his best placing is second place to Phil Heath in 2017. This was the last year Phil won the Olympia, and it was controversial because Phil was starting to develop a gut at that point, so a lot of people think Ramy should have won, and the judges only favored Phil because he was the reigning Mr. Olympia at the time. Now, Phil Heath's gut was a problem in 2017, don't get me wrong, but I think it's hard to make the case Ramy should have won. It's definitely not as controversial of a decision as Dorian Yates beating Nasser Al-Somebody in 1997. I mean, look here at the 2017 top 3 call-out. Phil has much better conditioning than Ramy. Although Ramy is massive and doesn't have a gut, he looks watery. There's very little separation in the delts or the quads. Compare that to Phil Heath or William Bonac, who both have much better separation. So I don't consider Ramy to be an uncrowned Mr. Olympia at this point, although if he can step up the conditioning to Bonac or Phil Heath levels, I think he could be unstoppable. So that's it for today, guys. If you liked the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and stay tuned for other bodybuilding content and news.